The Collie is widely considered the perfect shepherd, but DNA evidence proves we've been wrong for over a century. This breed isn't a pure, stable lineage. It's a collection of hidden genetic bottlenecks and complex history. Today we're peeling back the coat to reveal what the genome actually tells us about the Collie's true ancestry. If you think that sounds surprising, stay close. We're just scratching the surface. If you're enjoying this deep dive into canine genetics, make sure to subscribe for more breed histories. In 2004, National Geographic pointed to a study that changed the tone of the conversation. Researchers examined the DNA of 85 dog breeds, including the Collie, and what they found was not a decorative detail or a minor footnote. They found unique genetic variation that could help trace where breeds came from and how their stories unfolded. That meant the answer was not locked in coats, outlines, or old assumptions about rural tradition. It was written into the genome, in signals much older and far less tidy than the public picture of the Collie. That is where the trouble begins, because once you accept that the Collie can be read through DNA, the familiar story stops feeling complete. The breed no longer looks like a simple product of one place, one purpose, or one polished ideal. It starts to feel like the visible edge of a longer and more complicated chain, one shaped by work, movement, and the slow pressure of selection across generations. What seems refined may actually be the end result of many practical choices made by people who were not thinking about elegance at all, and that contradiction matters. The Collie has been admired for grace, intelligence, and loyalty, yet those qualities do not explain why its ancestry became so difficult to pin down. The 2004 findings opened a door, but they did not close the mystery. If DNA can preserve clues strong enough to separate one breed from another, then it can also expose how much of the Collie's identity was assembled, adjusted, and refined before the modern idea of a breed ever existed. In other words, the dog people think they know may be the final shape of a far less obvious beginning. The most unsettling part is how ordinary the clue first appeared. A breed study, a comparison across dozens of dogs, numbers on a page. Yet behind that dry framework was a challenge to the old habit of treating the Collie as if its present form told the whole story. The genetic record suggested otherwise. It implied variation, lineage, and the kind of layered past that does not announce itself in a single glance across a field. So the real question is not whether the Collie is beautiful or intelligent. That part is easy. The question is why a dog that feels so familiar could still be hiding a history this complex. Why would a breed so closely associated with order and discipline carry such a restless genetic signature? Why would one of the most recognizable herding dogs leave scientists with clues instead of a simple answer? Because the Collie was never just the image. And once the DNA begins to speak, the image stops being enough. What follows is the part that makes the old story collapse. The Collie's ancestry is not a straight line, but a trail of crossing paths, practical choices, and silent corrections made over centuries. If you think that sounds surprising, stay close, because the first crack in the legend is only where the real history starts to show. Then the fur is only the first clue. The real surprise arrives when the body itself starts giving away the secret. For a long time, the Collie was judged by what the eye could catch at a distance. The elegant outline, the balanced frame, the narrow muzzle, the way the head seems almost drawn with a ruler. Those traits created a kind of myth around the breed, as if refinement were simply the natural result of a noble lineage. But in 2013, a study published in PLOS Biology cut through that assumption with a much colder kind of evidence. Researchers identified genetic variants tied to visible canine traits, including body size and head shape, showing that what people read as a single polished type can actually arise from a small number of regions with powerful effects. This isn't just about style. The Collie, a dog of perceived presence, is actually a study in genetic engineering, not just evolution. Yet the PLOS biology findings suggest that the features people treat as a complete identity may be built from surprisingly limited switches in the genome. In other words, a narrow muzzle or a certain scale of body is not proof of a simple origin. It is proof that selection can work with striking efficiency, amplifying some traits while leaving deeper ancestry hidden underneath. And once that possibility enters the story, the whole picture shifts. The Collie stops being a fixed form and becomes something more unsettling. A result. Not a timeless design, but a surface shaped by repeated decisions, each one favoring a body that could move, turn, read pressure, and keep pace with changing demands. The visible dog you recognize in a pasture is therefore only the final layer of a much older process, one in which appearance was made useful, then made familiar, then made authoritative. That is why the 2013 evidence feels so important. It did not merely say that dogs vary. It showed that variation can be concentrated, almost engineered by nature and selection together, so that a few genetic differences can help produce the very silhouette people mistake for destiny. For the collie, this is a dangerous revelation because it breaks the habit of treating the breed's elegance as something pure or self-evident. The elegance is real, but it is also a record of pressure, choice, and reinforcement. Even the head tells on the history. The line from skull to muzzle, the slope that gives the breed its recognizable expression, is not a decorative accident. It is a sign that the breed's appearance was never simply inherited as a whole package. Pieces of it were pulled forward by breeders and working handlers who needed a dog that could think quickly, see clearly, and stay responsive in motion. The result was a pattern of traits that feels coherent now, yet was assembled over time from genetic ingredients that did not begin as a single, clean picture. Listen closely to what that means. If body size and head shape can be shaped by a limited set of genetic variants, then the collie's public face is only the visible edge of a larger argument written into its biology. The dog seems elegant because generations kept rewarding bodies that looked right, moved right, and worked right. But beneath that harmony is a history of filtering, narrowing, and amplifying specific features until they began to stand for the breed itself. That is the first real crack in the legend. The collie is not merely a graceful survivor of rural tradition, it is a breed whose most recognizable traits may be the result of a few potent genetic levers, turned again and again until they became a signature. And once you understand that, a more difficult question opens up. If the exterior can be assembled so efficiently, what else about the collie's past was assembled from parts people never noticed at all? The answer starts where appearances stop being enough, because the next layer is not about shape anymore. It is about movement, adaptation, and the long road that turned a practical herding dog into one of the most visually specific breeds in the world. The trouble begins when the collie is no longer treated like a finished portrait, but like a moving population with a messy past. For years it was tempting to imagine a straight line. Wolves became dogs became herders, and herders eventually became the collie. Clean, elegant, easy to tell, but the genetic story refuses that simplicity. In 2017, a review in Nature Reviews Genetics, published at https://www.nature.com, articles, NRG, 2017.67, pulled together a harder picture of canine history. It described multiple population bottlenecks tied to domestication and later to breed formation, along with admixture between dog and wolf populations. That matters, because bottlenecks do not just reduce numbers, they compress history, erase some branches, and sharpen others until what survives can look deceptively uniform. So when people see a collie and assume they are looking at a lineage preserved in one neat stream from antiquity to the present, they are already looking through the wrong lens. The collie carries the result of repeated narrowing, not a single founding event. That means the breed's present form is a late answer to many earlier pressures: survival in local working populations, shifts in human preference, and the genetic residue left behind when diverse dogs were pulled through smaller and smaller filters. And the most unsettling part is this: a bottleneck can make a breed look more pure precisely when its history has become more mixed and more compressed. The surface steadiness can hide a deeper churn. In the case of the collie, that churn likely involved regional dogs, whose differences were never erased all at once, but gradually folded into the working type that shepherds recognized and trusted. Mountain, hill, and farm dogs did not need to share a single pedigree to produce similar behavior. They needed to solve the same problem in the same rough landscapes. That is why the collie's identity cannot be traced like a royal family tree. It behaves more like a river system. Branches split, rejoin, disappear underground, and emerge somewhere else with the same force but a different shape. The breed's intelligence, sensitivity, and herding control make more sense when seen as outcomes of that long exchange, not as trophies delivered by one ancestral source. The 2017 review also forces another uncomfortable idea into the frame. Dog history has never been sealed off from wolf history. Admixture between the two populations means the boundary was porous at different moments, in different places, under different human and ecological conditions. That does not turn the collie into something wild, and it does not reduce the value of the breed. It does something more interesting. It reveals that the working dogs humans selected were already carrying a past shaped by contact, overlap, and repeated sorting. What seems domesticated and stable today was assembled from movements that were anything but still. This is where the story becomes larger than the collie itself. The breed is not an isolated exception. It is a visible example of how canine populations changed under pressure, first through domestication, then through local selection, and finally through the modern habit of freezing variation into standards. The collie's polished outline came late. Before that, there was flexibility, exchange, and a lot of room for regional difference. And if that feels like it weakens the romance of the breed, it does the opposite. It gives the collie a richer inheritance, not a single origin myth, but a history dense enough to survive climate, terrain, human fashion, and the constant reshaping of work. If you want to see how deep that inheritance goes, stay with the next layer, because the real turning point comes when selection stops following usefulness alone and starts chasing an image. The moment that happens, the collie begins to change in ways that tell us as much about people as about dogs. And that is where the ancestry stops being merely biological and starts becoming cultural, sharpened by choice, memory, and desire. I've put together a full guide on the breeding markers we're discussing today, linked in the description below. Then the map finally got sharper. In 2019, a study in Nature Communications sequenced the dog genome and linked variants to 16 different phenotypes, including body size differences. That mattered because it moved the collie out of the fog of guesswork and into a measurable history. What had once looked like a graceful outline on a farm lane could now be read as part of a broader evolutionary record written into the dog genome itself. And the striking part is this: the DNA did not tell a story of decoration first and function second. It showed that visible traits were being organized by layers of inherited variation, with some changes becoming easier to track once researchers could compare them across breeds. For the collie, that meant its elegance was never just an ornament. The same biological machinery that helped shape size, structure, and other differences also preserved clues about why this breed feels so balanced in motion, so alert in posture, so ready to read a field before a human even speaks. This is where the old idea starts to collapse. A breed like the collie was never simply fixed by one perfect image and then copied forever. The genome points to a deeper process, one in which selection kept drawing from a wider pool of possibilities until certain patterns became familiar enough to call a breed. That is why the collie can look refined and still carry the memory of rough terrain, cold weather, and constant adjustment. Its form is not a mask hiding history. Its form is history, made visible. The 2019 findings also widened the lens. Once scientists could tie distinct dog traits to specific genetic signals, the question was no longer only where a breed came from, but how its many differences were assembled over time. That shift matters for the collie because it explains why the breed can seem so singular at a glance, while still resting on a deep reservoir of variation. The more closely you look, the less the dog appears to be a static symbol, and the more it resembles a living archive of selection. And that archive becomes even more revealing when you follow what humans did next. Because once a breed is admired for a look, people begin protecting that look, then amplifying it, then narrowing it. At that point, the collie stops being only a working dog shaped by need and starts becoming a cultural object shaped by preference. That change did not erase the older biology. It layered over it. Beneath the polished silhouette, the older logic stayed intact, waiting for the next generation of evidence to expose it. So, the partial answer is real now. The collie's identity is measurable, not mythical. But the measurement does something more unsettling than confirm the breed's strength. It shows how much of that strength was assembled from variation that humans did not design all at once, but gradually recognized, selected, and fixed in place. If you are seeing the collie differently now, keep following that feeling, because the next turn is where appearance, fashion, and control begin to argue with ancestry. Inside the border collie, the illusion of sameness starts to crack, not at the edge of the breed, but at its center. In 2021, a study in Scientific Reports looked at genetic diversity and disease management in border collies using genotypic data from 255 dogs and a genealogical database of 83,996 border collies. Those numbers matter because they expose something a polished image cannot hide. This breed is not a sealed box. It is a population with layers, branches, and inherited differences that still shape health, performance, and risk. It's a far cry from the perfect silhouette. When we look at a breeding population of over 83,996 dogs, the myth of the perfect collie completely falls apart. The paper shows how misleading that can be. Once you examine a real breeding population at scale, the breed stops looking like a finished object and starts behaving like an archive under pressure. Some lines are tightly connected. Others carry a broader spread of variation. Some histories are overrepresented because popular sires left a heavy mark. Others disappear quietly, even if they once contributed to the working character people still admire today. And this is where the story turns sharper. Diversity is not only a measure of ancestry. In a breed like the Border Collie, it becomes a practical question of survival. The same variation that preserves flexibility can also help breeders track disease patterns, avoid harmful concentration, and protect future dogs from the costs of narrowing too far. The study does not romanticize that process. It makes it concrete. Behind the elegance of the Border Collie is a breeding structure that has to be watched, mapped, and corrected, because selection can improve one trait while quietly tightening the entire genetic frame around it. That tension explains why the Border Collie can look so unified in motion and still be genetically uneven beneath the surface. A herd dog on a hillside seems effortless, almost inevitable, as if every animal in the breed were cut from the same cloth. But the data say otherwise. The population is broad, stratified, and historically connected, built through generations of choice rather than a single moment of creation. What appears as one identity is really a managed continuity, held together by people who selected for ability, by communities that bred for function, and by records that now reveal how much variation survived the process. So the mystery deepens in a more unsettling way. The collie is not only a breed with an old ancestry, it is a breed whose internal diversity still carries the marks of the decisions that formed it. Even now, the genetic map does not describe a perfect unity. It describes balance, loss, concentration, and recovery. It describes what happens when a beloved working line becomes famous enough to be protected, but fragile enough to need constant genetic care. If you want to understand why the Border Collie remains so alert, so responsive, so alive to movement and command, you have to accept this contradiction. The breed's strength comes from structure, but its future depends on variation. And once that is clear, the older image loses its innocence. The collie is no longer just a symbol of rural grace. It is evidence of how human preference can preserve brilliance and endanger it at the same time. That is why the recent genetic record matters so much. It does not simply confirm a lineage. It shows a living population under management, with a memory large enough to reach across 83,996 registered animals, and specific enough to expose where the breed still bends, still splits, and still resists becoming a single, fixed thing. If you keep following that line, the next question is not whether the collie is diverse. It is how much of that diversity has already been narrowed out of sight. Then the story takes a sharper turn. A dog can look composed in the field, fast on the flank, almost reading a flock before it moves, and still carry a hidden fault line in the same blood that made that brilliance possible. In 2016, geneticist Oliver Foreman and his team published a landmark study in G3, Genes, Talos, Genomes, Genetics, identifying an inversion in the FAM134B gene as the driver of sensory neuropathy. That detail matters because it moves the breed's history out of the realm of beauty and into the realm of cost. This was not a vague suspicion or a loose clinical impression. It was a specific genetic finding tied to a specific disorder in a breed already known for precision and stamina. And once that inversion entered the picture, the collie's story became harder to romanticize. The same long process that favored responsiveness, control, and intense herding instinct could also preserve a vulnerability that sits quietly until it begins to change the dog's movement, sensation, and trust in its own body. That is the unsettling part. Selection does not carve only strength. it also narrows possibilities. When humans repeatedly reward a working type for the same successful traits, they can amplify the line so thoroughly that a harmful variant travels along with the prized ones. The Border Collie, in that sense, becomes a record of both achievement and inheritance, a living archive in which excellence and fragility are not opposites, but neighbors. And this is where the earlier image starts to crack open. The breed is not just a triumph of useful breeding, it is also proof that usefulness can carry invisible debt. A head that turns quickly, a body that holds tension without wasting motion, a mind that locks onto signal after signal. Those are celebrated traits. Yet the genome can keep a quieter memory, one that does not show up in the silhouette, but appears later in the nerves, the gait, the hesitation before a step. Look at the implication closely, and the contradiction deepens. The collie's reputation for intelligence is real, but intelligence alone never built the breed. Neither did elegance. What endured was a practical pattern of choices, repeated across generations, until performance became identity. The problem is that identity built this way can hide its own price tag. A dog line shaped to excel under pressure may also become more exposed when one hidden change enters a crowded genetic background and stays there. That is why the 2016 FAM 134B finding feels so important. It does more than name a disease mechanism. It reveals how the same historical pressure that helped form a dependable herding dog also left room for a breed-specific weakness to persist. The collie is not simply the product of selection, it is the product of selection with consequences, some visible in the work, and others buried until science gives them a name. If you want to follow that thread further, keep your attention on what the eye cannot catch. The danger is often quieter than the legend, and in a breed celebrated for reading motion, the deepest truth may be found in the one movement that gradually stops feeling normal. By the time the genetic picture sharpens, the collie stops looking like a polished answer and starts looking like a long argument between history and expectation. The face may seem familiar, the carriage refined, the movement almost effortless, yet the evidence keeps refusing that neat surface. In 2019, Nature Communications reported a dog genome study that linked variants to 16 phenotypes, including differences in body size. That matters here because size is never just size in a herding breed. It is leverage, speed, endurance, and the kind of balance that lets a collie turn on a line of motion without wasting a step. What once looked like a stable type now reads like a set of traits assembled across time, each one carrying a different piece of the story. And the story does not move in a straight line. The 2017 review in Nature Reviews Genetics described a far messier canine past, multiple population bottlenecks tied to domestication and the later formation of breeds, plus admixture between dog and wolf populations. That does not give the collie a single birthplace. It gives the collie a route through compression and release, through isolation and exchange, through periods when a working population narrowed and then was reshaped again by selection. The breed's apparent clarity is the final effect of a process that was never clear while it was happening. Even the body itself carries that complexity in visible pieces. A 2013 study in PLOS Biology identified genetic variants associated with morphology in dogs, including body size and head shape. Those findings are useful because they show how quickly a few genetic changes can pull a population toward a recognizable form. But that also exposes the trap. A recognizable form is not the same thing as a simple origin. The collie could become elegant in outline while still carrying a layered inheritance underneath, one built from local working dogs, shifting regions, and repeated practical decisions made far from any modern kennel standard. That is why the later disease studies feel so revealing instead of incidental. In 2016, G3 Genes Genomes Janus Genetics described an inversion in FAM 134B associated with sensory neuropathy in the Border Collie. The finding is specific, technical, and devastating in its implication. The same closed breeding logic that can sharpen a working line can also keep a harmful variant moving quietly through it. Then, in 2021, scientific reports examined genetic diversity and disease management in Border Collies using genotypic data from 255 dogs and a genealogical database of 83,096 Border Collies. Numbers like that turn abstraction into population memory. They show a breed that is not a single frozen object, but a living structure with layers of relatedness, pressure, and inherited risk. Taken together, those studies closed the circle. The collie was not born from a pure visual idea. It emerged from old European herding influences, from dogs that moved between neighboring regions, from bottlenecks, from admixture, from repeated selection for work that rewarded judgment more than ornament. Later, breed systems gave that history a cleaner face, but they did not erase what came before. They only masked it in a shape that looked finished. So the final image is not a dog that simply became refined. It is a collie carrying a deep demographic archive inside a graceful outline. That is the real discovery. The breed's identity was never waiting inside appearance, fully formed. It was built through pressure, movement, and survival, until a working animal became a symbol, and a symbol became a standard. If that changes the way you see the collie, it should. Some lineages do not just inherit traits. They inherit entire centuries of decisions and the quiet force of every dog that had to earn its place before